Okay, our next interview is with Richard Rama, who is a New Yorker and an expert in Brazilian material in Latin America, etc. And Richard, why don't you tell us a little about your background, your family, siblings, education, what your parents did, etc. Let's just start things off.
Well, my parents were both educators. They worked for the New York City Board of Education. I grew up in Brooklyn. My father was a Columbia University graduate. My mother was a Brooklyn College graduate. I have a bachelor's degree from Brooklyn College, a master's degree in Latin American history from NYU. Cut that.
Cut that
From Indiana University. And then afterwards, I went on to do coursework for a PhD at NYU, but I started to veer off on a tangent. Instead of teaching history in a university, I got more and more interested in books as objects.
When did this occur?
Well, it started when I was at Indiana University. I met Charles Boxer, who had sold his library to the Lilly Library at Indiana University in 1960. And part of the deal was that he would spend about 3 months of each year on campus giving a seminar and working at the Lilly Library. And I never took the seminar with him, but I had admired him for many years through his writings, and I went to look him up. I introduced myself. I showed him a paper that I had written. He read it, and he made some very constructive criticisms, including telling me that I should look at Borba de Moraes's bibliography of rare Brazilian books, and pointing out to me the importance of rare books in connection with scholarship, which is something that I hadn't thought of too much until that point.
How long did you stay there? Did you stay at Lilly for a while?
I was at Indiana for 2 years.
2 years. While you were there, did you do any book buying or book selling on the side?
Well, up until I got back to New York, I had done book buying, but only paperbacks and things I needed or thought I needed for courses. I always bought more books than I really needed, but I never bought an antiquarian book until I think about 1967, more or less, when I was back in New York. I had a Lehman Fellowship to study beyond the master's level, and it paid $5,000 a year tax-free. And at that time,
that's a lot of money.
That was about what an assistant professor would be netting after taxes.
Right.
And I was living at home with my parents. So one of the things that I turned the money toward was book buying. And I started to frequent used bookstores on the old Booksellers Row, which was already in decline, but there was still...
Stop for a second. Could you just talk a little bit about the Booksellers Row? It's been mentioned a couple of times, but I'd like to have some kind of expansion of it. Talk a little bit about what it used to be.
Yeah, well, I never saw it when it was in its prime,
right,
but it was still hanging on in the late 1960s, early 1970s. There must have still been maybe 8 or 10 shops that were open, some of them with quite extensive numbers of secondhand books, and each one of them, or most of them, had a handful of really rare books as well. And I made a few purchases there, and I also saw an ad in the New York Times for a sale at Park Burnett Galleries. And I went up there just out of curiosity. And I was interested in Robert Southey and his connection with Portugal and Brazil, and also Portuguese literature, Spanish literature. And there was a first edition of Southey's Life of Nelson in the sale. And I was able to buy it, I forget if it was $15 or something like that. And there was also, I looked at a number of other books, and one of the books that I had been attracted to was an Italian translation of Lopez de Gomara's work on the conquest of Mexico by Cortez. And I had already an English edition in paperback form that would serve me just as well as this, but the paper and the binding really appealed to me. But it was estimated at $100 to $150, I think. And I wasn't going to pay that kind of money for a book. That was big money in those days.
Yeah, right.
So, but it opened at $20. John Marion was taking the sale, and nobody bid $20. So he asked, would anybody bid 10? And I couldn't control myself. I put my hand up. But somebody bid 15. But I was already hooked. I bid 20, and I got it for $20. And there were a number of other incidents of that kind, so that after a few years, I began to think about what I was going to be doing with my life, and the book world appealed to me more and more. Also, because I had been at Indiana University, about that time, David Randall's book, Dukedom Large Enough, came out, and I read that, and it was kind of another impetus, the romance of the rare book trade.
When did you decide that you were going to do this for a living?
Well, in '69, I had a couple of shelves of these kinds of books that I had bought, partly because they appealed to me as objects, partly because I thought they were bargains. And I decided I'll put out a list. I'll put prices on these books so that it won't hurt so much to part with them. like the book I bought for $20, I priced at $250, and so on and so forth. I put out the list. I put a small ad in the book review section of the New York Times, and I actually had the temerity to ask people to send in $1 to get the list.
Wow!
But I collected about $50 from this
to pay for the ad,
more or less, I think. And I sent it out, and a few of the people actually bought books, and I also sent the list out to some of the major universities, and a significant number of the books were sold. So I began to think, well, maybe there's something to this. But I had an awful lot to learn, because I had never worked for another bookseller. I didn't have anyone in my family that was in the book trade. I had never worked in a library. I had this subject knowledge from my studies in history, but it took me another 3 or 4 years to even be considered a knowledgeable novice in the book as an object.
When did you become a member of the association?
I think it was 1973.
And when was your first book fair? Do you recall?
It was right after that, either 73 or 74.
Was it in New York?
Yeah.
You've done other book fairs.
And then I did the New York Book Fair every year, I think from 73 until 1989. I'm not absolutely sure if 73 or 74
Yes,
was
yeah.
the first year. But, and then I did the London Fair in the late 70s and early 80s exactly 6 times. And I did a fair in Venice in 1986, connected
Yeah,
with the ILAB Congress.
Well,
And-
I think I met you and your wife for the first time at an LA book fair when we had Quaritch bought us all that expensive breakfast out on the patio.
Oh, yes,
If
yes.
you remember that.
Yes,
And they said...
in
"Why
the
don't-"
old Ambassador Hotel.
in the old Ambassador, and someone said, "Why don't you sit next to Richard's wife because she doesn't speak English and neither do you." So I thought that was a good way to say
And
So
it
I did.
worked.
And it worked. We've been friends ever since. Do you find the computer to be a friend or a foe?
Oh, it's definitely a friend.
Can you elaborate on that, your experience, your business?
Well, there are a number of ways that it's a friend. First, just as a word processor, I'm a halfway decent typist, but in the early days before computers and word processors, it would take me a tremendous amount of time to write up a letter or a description because I was always make mistakes and I have to tear it up and do it over again. With the computer, you don't have to really worry about that. You just look it over and you make a change, and it's much, much simpler.
Yeah, you get your mailing listers on there, your inventory. It's been a wonderful boom.
Yeah.
And I've also...
I felt at one time I felt that it was an enemy, but I learned to embrace it.
Well, I think all of us as booksellers, not computer people, were kind of, a little scared of this whole new technology.
Exactly. And in the early days, it wasn't quite as helpful as it is now as the computers develop more powerful
I mean, there was
memories.
Interlock was the first of the matching services, and that morphed into A-Libris.
Yeah.
And now there's all these other matching services that are sort of working around. When you first started in the trade, were there any people who were your mentors or people who you would go to for advice, etc.?
Well, I would say that Steve Weissman and having one of my senior moments now.
We all have them. Steve Weissman of Zimmern's.
At Lathrop C. Harper.
Doug Parsonage?
Exactly, Douglas Parsonage.
What a memory. He was brilliant.
And a wonderfully kind man.
Very.
And very patient with stupidities uttered by young
in its day,
booksellers.
Lathrop Harper was one of the major booksellers in the world, not just in New York City.
Yeah. And then in a way, also Arthur Freeman was very helpful. I met him when he was still in Cambridge as an agent for Quaritch, and he convinced me that bidding in London sales through Quaritch was a good idea. And over the years, that has paid enormous dividends. They give excellent advice, and even now, it's an invaluable aid.
Yeah. That's a whole other subject about auctions and stuff. But as you've gone along with the computer and the computer world, I think that most of us are on various services. Who do you subscribe to?
The two that I have now are AB Books and this the one that was formerly connected with the ILAB that's now
Biblio?
no. I think it's called ILABdatabase.com now.
Something like that, yeah.
But it's no longer officially the ILAB.
No.
but it's searchable by ILAB. So I have my books on the ILAB website.
What percentage of your sales are generated by the computer versus what you do on your normal course of events? From the house, from the catalogs,
Yeah. That's a good question. I'm not sure what the percentage is, but it's a significant amount, maybe 15-20%.
And the balance of your sales come from catalogs, or?
Well, I haven't done a real catalog in a while, but I've done I do lists from time to time that I put up on my own website. By the way, my own website is also a source of occasional sales.
Yeah. But see, you're in a very specialized kind of area. So if people were looking for books on Latin America and especially Brazil, you would stand out among all the others.
And also, I think that I benefit more from these online services than a lot of people, because a higher percentage of my books are books that nobody else has.
Right. That's huge. When you go on the internet and see 27 copies of the same book at different prices, it can be frightening. Why? But I think everybody's idea is to have the only copy on the internet. What do you think are the biggest challenges that we as booksellers face as we head off?
I think the biggest challenge is just to stay solvent.
That's right. How do you see the customer base that we're going to be working with?
I think that for somebody like myself who is interested, although I do business with modern books, Portuguese first editions and 20th century and literary magazines, I have to confess that my greatest interest is in older books. And I think there are less and less people that are capable of understanding some of the older books. There are less and less people that are well-grounded in history. There are less and less people that know languages, Latin, Greek, French.
Yeah, that's true. It's true. What are some of your, when you first started in the trade, what were some of your recollections, early recollections of the trade? Some great finds you may have made, mistakes you might have made, anything that sticks out?
Well, I'll tell you about a mistake that I made. I attended it must have been 69 or 70, I attended a sale of Plandom book auctions on Long Island. And I don't remember if I bought one or two books, but the one book I remember was a Kidder book, travel book on Brazil, and a bookseller with a ponytail came up to me and told me that wasn't such a good purchase, that I had paid too much money for the book and it was hard to sell, and he was right.
Do you still have it?
No, but I had it a long time. Eventually the price caught
up with you, yeah. You are still traveling back and forth between Portugal and the States, and you still maintain two residences, and occasionally you issue catalogs out of Portugal.
We've done a few catalogs using Julietta's name. Haven't done that in a while, but one of these days we're going to do another one, I think.
Yeah, why not? When we talk about entering the book trade today, people have mixed emotions. What do you think of it? Do you think that this is a business that has a future, or do you think this is a business that is slowly but surely destroying?
No, I think it will always have a future. There'll be tremendous changes, but as a departed friend of mine once said, it's the last of the liberal arts.
Who was that friend? Did you say?
Nick Zachas.
Oh, Nick Sarkis. Yeah, sure. Yeah, people often wonder whether we will survive as an association. If we look at our ABAA association, more than 50% of our members are 60 years old or more.
Yeah, but I think that while there aren't that many really young people in the trade, there are some promising ones, and I think that there will be people entering the trade in midlife, doctors, lawyers, businessmen who will get interested in books and at some point decide that they want to have a different kind of career or turn a hobby into a business, as has happened in the past.
I think there's a lot of that right now in our association. Okay. When you think about the world we live in today, Richard, in your opinion, who are some of the great booksellers that we have today? without hurting anybody's feelings.
Oh, boy.
Just, I know that there are many. Just name a couple that you think
Oh, gee. But I'm really on the spot now because I'm probably going to leave out some.
We'll all leave out.
But I think Bill Reese, Rudolph Chaminade, Richard Land, Nicholas Poole Wilson.
There's one generation behind us, basically.
Arthur Freeman.
Arthur's in our generation, too.
Yeah. Justin Schiller.
Justin. But who are some of the young booksellers that you see as the future of our trade?
Well, there's one that I think is very promising. He's the president of the Canadian Association. Eric Washke.
Is that what's his firm name?
It's called Wayfarers.
Wayfarers, sure.
In Vancouver, and I think he has a shop in Washington State also. He's very dynamic. He's traveling all over the place. Has a tremendous amount of energy, buying, selling.
Yeah, well, energy and money are two things that go hand in hand in this business.
Yeah.
Well, if there was one thing, Richard, that you would say to a young bookseller who wanted to go into the trade and came to you and said, Mr. Raymer, I'd like to be a bookseller. Please advise me on what you think I should do. You would probably say to them...
Well, I think that if they're going into the book trade cold, they really do need capital nowadays. It's not easy to acquire a decent inventory.
No, it's not.
It was much easier when I started. Just to digress a little bit, I recall that there were sales at Swan Galleries almost every week of the year. They must have had at least 45 or 50 sales a year of books, each one with 300, 400, 500 books. And there would be really good books in in every sale. And it was possible for a bookseller like myself to go to these sales, maybe not buy so much, but learn a great deal about what was good and what wasn't good, and acquire a few things along the way. Now, it's much, much more difficult to build up an inventory.
Well, I see that most of the galleries don't want to handle the sort of bread and butter books that we grew up on. Yeah. I guess there's no money in that.
Yeah, I assume that's true. I've heard that I don't know if this is absolutely true, but I've heard that Sotheby's and Christie's don't want to take individual lots for that are worth less than $10,000.
It used to be less than 1,000. That's the way times have changed. So, what are your plans, Richard, for the next foreseeable future? Are you going to be doing any book fairs ever again?
I don't have any plans to do book fairs. I'm a little bit tired.
Yeah. You got to that stage of your life.
I did a lot of them, and it's much more relaxing.
Believe me, I know the feeling. It's much more relaxing.
But I don't rule it out completely. Under the right circumstances, I might want to do it.
And
I think also another reason for my not doing it is that the dynamics of the book fairs have changed a lot. And while I have maybe a few dozen really great books, you have to really make it worthwhile, you have to have the kind of inventory that some of those people I mentioned before have, that with hundreds of really...
big critical mass. Yeah. Well, thanks very much, Richard, for participating in the program.
Well, it's been a lot of fun.
Enjoyed it, and we'll see you around the campus.